The Crimson Nexus didn't advertise its location, didn't appear on station directories, and certainly didn't welcome walk-in customers, which made it particularly unfortunate that Jacob Torres had just walked in. He'd been following what he thought were signs toward the main concourse after his freighter docked for emergency repairs on Station COS 7, a waypoint so far off major shipping lanes that it appeared on navigational charts with the notation, "Avoid unless desperate." Jacob was desperate. His ship's coolant system had developed a leak that turned the cargo bay into a sauna, and COS 7 was the only station within 3 days' travel that could fabricate the replacement parts. The repairs would take 6 hours. Jacob had decided to find a bar, have a drink, maybe some food that wasn't freeze-dried or reconstituted from protein paste. He'd followed corridor signs that became increasingly vague, taken a turn that seemed promising, and found himself at an unmarked door with a red light above it. Red usually meant open for business. Jacob, whose knowledge of station semiotics was limited to green means go, and flashing yellow means the life support is failing, pushed through. The bar beyond was larger than expected, dimly lit in shades of amber and shadow. Tables scattered across the main floor, booths along the walls, a bar running the length of the far side. Maybe 40 people occupied the space, which seemed sparse for the size of the room until Jacob noticed how carefully everyone was positioned. No backs to doors, clear sight lines to exits, enough space between tables that a fight wouldn't immediately involve bystanders. The conversations were quieter than usual bar chatter. Whispers and low murmurs, the kind of talking people did when they didn't want to be overheard or recorded. Most patrons were armed, weapons displayed openly in the casual way that suggested this was normal rather than threatening. Jacob's survival instincts, honed by 3 years coordinating freight in disputed territories, started sending urgent signals. This was not a normal bar. This was probably not a safe bar. He should probably leave. But he was already here, and leaving immediately after entering would draw attention. Drawing attention in places where everyone was armed seemed inadvisable. So Jacob did what he did best when encountering situations beyond his expertise. He committed to looking like he belonged. He walked to the bar with what he hoped was appropriate confidence. The bartender was a massive individual whose species Jacob couldn't immediately identify, with facial features that suggested either extensive combat experience or really unfortunate genetics. Possibly both. "What do you serve?" Jacob asked, keeping his voice neutral and polite. The bartender looked at him for a long moment, possibly assessing whether he was stupid, brave, or suicidal. "Alcohol, various kinds." "You want specifics or surprises?" "Surprise me, nothing that'll kill me." "That's usually extra." Jacob wasn't sure if that was a joke. He decided to treat it as one and managed a weak laugh. The bartender produced a glass of something amber that smelled like industrial solvent mixed with optimism. Jacob paid with station credits and retreated to a corner booth, settling in with his back to the wall in unconscious imitation of every other patron. The drink was terrible. Jacob sipped it slowly because pouring it out seemed wasteful, and because having something to do with his hands made him feel less conspicuous. Around him, the bar's conversations continued in their careful whispers. He caught fragments, talk of contracts and territories, names he didn't recognize, references to events that sounded vaguely like organized crime or possibly legitimate business. In places like COS 7, the distinction was academic. He was calculating whether he could reasonably leave after finishing half the drink when the door opened and 3 women entered. The bar went silent, not gradually, not with a gradual dying of conversations as people noticed the new arrivals. Instantly, completely silent, as if someone had cut audio to the entire room. Jacob looked up from his terrible drink and understood immediately that something significant was happening, even if he didn't understand what. The first woman was Velkari. Jacob recognized the species from shipping manifests, though he'd never met one in person. tall and elegant, with bone structure that made human models look unrefined. Her ears rose in those characteristic tapered points, and her eyes shifted through colors as she surveyed the room, currently settling on a deep violet that Jacob's limited knowledge suggested meant focused attention. She wore robes that were somehow both simple and incredibly expensive, the kind of clothing that didn't need ornamentation to communicate status. The second woman was Crithian, her skin bearing the bioluminescent patterns that Jacob knew marked warrior caste. The patterns pulsed gently with her heartbeat, creating subtle light shows across her arms and neck. She moved like violence contained in human form, every step controlled and purposeful. Her species didn't do casual. Everything was intent. The third woman appeared human, or close enough that Jacob couldn't spot obvious differences from across the room. But something in the way she moved suggested augmentation, too fluid, too controlled, the kind of biomechanical enhancement that cost more than Jacob's ship. Her eyes swept the room with the calculated assessment of someone trained to identify threats and neutralize them. The three women walked to a table in the center of the room, not near walls, not in corners, completely exposed. They sat with synchronized precision, forming a triangle that put them each in each other's sight lines. And then they began to speak. The Velkari woman spoke first, her voice carrying through the silent bar with formal cadence. The territorial disputes of the Outer Reach have persisted for 17 years. 3 powers claim jurisdiction. Blood has been spent without resolution. The Crithian responded, her voice deeper, textured with harmonics that suggested her species' vocal structure was more complex than human. The Dominion acknowledges ancestral claims but cannot abandon strategic holdings without compensation. Trade routes through the Beck Rin corridor represent 12% of our commercial activity. The human woman spoke with precise diction, each word placed deliberately. Human Intelligence Division has monitored the conflict and identified external actors profiting from prolonged instability. Corporate interests manipulate all 3 powers. Jacob's translator was struggling with the formal phrasing, archaic structures it hadn't encountered in casual conversation. He was catching maybe 70% of the meaning, but he understood enough to recognize this wasn't normal bar conversation. The Velkari woman continued. The matriarchy proposes territorial concessions in the Outer Reach in exchange for exclusive trade rights in the Becklin corridor for a period of 20 standard years, with revenue sharing at 18% to the Dominion. The Crithian nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and calculation. The Dominion accepts these terms conditional on intelligence sharing regarding external manipulation. Corporate actors must be identified and neutralized. The human woman's expression didn't change. Human Intelligence Division will provide full disclosure of identified actors and coordinate sanctions across allied jurisdictions. In exchange, both powers will grant humanity observer status in Outer Reach governance during the transition period. They continued in this vein, building layers of agreement with each exchange, constructing something that sounded like treaty negotiations, but without any of the usual diplomatic infrastructure. No recorders, no legal staff, no official witnesses beyond the bar's deadly clientele. Jacob watched, fascinated despite his growing certainty that he'd stumbled into something way beyond his clearance level. Around him, the bar's patrons remained frozen in absolute silence. Even the bartender had stopped moving, standing motionless behind the bar like a statue carved from muscle and bad decisions. Then the Velkari woman's eyes swept across the room and landed on Jacob. She stopped mid-sentence. The other 2 women followed her gaze. Every person in the bar tensed infinitesimally, a collective preparation for violence that Jacob felt like pressure against his skin. Jacob tried to make himself smaller, which was difficult when you were already sitting in a booth trying to disappear into the upholstery. He considered several responses, pretending he hadn't noticed, waving cheerfully like an idiot, diving under the table and hoping for the best. Before he could decide, the Velkari woman spoke directly to him in Standard. "You have heard the accord spoken. Do you understand what that means?" Jacob's mouth was suddenly very dry. His terrible drink sat forgotten on the table. Every eye in the bar was on him, and he could feel the weight of attention from people who killed professionally and were very good at it. "Not even a little bit, no," he said, because honesty seemed like the only option when surrounded by people who could probably detect lies through pheromones or microexpressions, or whatever skills assassins developed. The Crithian woman made a sound, not quite a laugh, more like breaking glass being amused. "A witness who admits ignorance, that's refreshing." The human woman gestured to an empty chair at their table. "Join us, witness. You've become part of something, whether you intended to or not." Jacob looked at the door, calculated the distance, estimated his chances of making it out before someone decided his exit was problematic. The math was not encouraging. He stood, picked up his terrible drink because abandoning it seemed rude, and walked to the center table on legs that were trying very hard not to shake. The three women watched him approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to amusement to calculation. Jacob sat in the offered chair, set down his drink, and folded his hands on the table to keep them from trembling. "I'm going to guess that I should have stayed on my ship." "Probably," the Velkari woman agreed. "But here you are. I am Matriarch Saraskal. This is Warlord Kethara of the Crithian Dominion and Director Una Reeves of Human Intelligence Division. And you are Jacob Torres, Freight Coordinator, currently regretting my navigation choices." Director Reeves smiled slightly. "You've witnessed the Trifled Accord, Mr. Torres. Do you know what that is?" "I'm going to guess it's important based on how everyone stopped breathing when you started talking." "The Trifled Accord," Saris explained in that same formal cadence, "is a pact between three powers negotiated in neutral space, witnessed by those outside the agreement. It is binding under Galactic Convention when properly executed. The key requirement is neutral witnesses who can verify that all parties entered freely and understood the terms." Understanding was beginning to dawn, and with it, a sinking feeling in Jacob's stomach that suggested his repairs were going to be the least of his problems. "And I'm a witness." "You are now," Kethara said. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that Jacob's translator helpfully informed him indicated satisfaction and predatory amusement. "By law and tradition, you hold leverage over our pact. You can verify its terms, testify to its authenticity, potentially void it if you claim deception. This also makes you incredibly valuable," Reeves added, "and incredibly vulnerable. Every person in this bar is currently calculating whether kidnapping or killing you better serves their interests." Jacob looked around the room. The frozen silence had shifted slightly. Patrons were indeed moving in small increments, hands edging toward weapons, weight shifting in preparation for action. The bartender had produced something from beneath the bar that looked like a weapon designed by people who thought conventional firearms were too subtle. "So what happens now?" Jacob asked, proud that his voice only shook slightly. "Now," Sarah said, rising gracefully from her chair, "we get you somewhere safer than the galaxy's most lethal bar, and we discuss your options." Kethara stood as well, her movements flowing like controlled violence waiting for direction. "Also, we prevent anyone here from deciding you're more valuable dead than alive." Reeves remained seated for one more moment, her eyes sweeping the room with that calculated assessment. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the bar. "The witness is under protection of the Accord. Anyone who harms him voids the pact and earns the combined enmity of three powers. Consider this carefully before making poor decisions." She stood, and the three women formed a loose triangle around Jacob's chair, a formation that managed to be both protective and vaguely threatening. "Are you able to walk, Mr. Torres?" Sarah asked, "or should we carry you?" "I can walk," Jacob said, standing on legs that were functioning through sheer stubbornness. Though I feel like I should mention I just came in here for a drink and to kill time before my ship finishes repairs. The universe has a sense of humor, Cathara observed, usually an unpleasant one. They moved toward the door, three of the galaxy's most dangerous women escorting a freight coordinator who'd made one wrong turn and ended up witnessing something that would apparently reshape power dynamics across multiple sectors. Behind them, the bar remained silent, its patrons frozen between calculation and self-preservation. Jacob made it out of the Crimson Nexus alive, which was an achievement. He had a feeling that staying alive was about to become significantly more challenging. The secure suite was several levels above the Crimson Nexus, in a section of Station Cost 7 that Jacob had never accessed before. His station authorization didn't even register these corridors as existing. Apparently, there were whole neighborhoods that only appeared on navigation systems if you had the right clearances. Security protocols increased with each checkpoint. Biometric scanners, armed guards whose species Jacob couldn't identify, energy barriers that probably classified as war crimes under 7 different jurisdictions. By the time they reached the suite, Jacob felt like he'd been processed through immigration into a hostile nation. The suite itself was larger than his ship, furnished with the kind of luxury that suggested money was a concept other people worried about. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the station's exterior and the dead space beyond. No traffic, no nearby stations, just empty void in every direction. Perfect privacy, which probably also meant perfect isolation if things went wrong. Saris gestured to a chair that looked more comfortable than Jacob's entire life. "Sit. We need to explain what's happened, what it means, and what your options are." Jacob sat. The chair was indeed extremely comfortable, which somehow made everything worse. "I'm getting the impression that my options are limited." "Perceptive," Director Reeves said, settling into a chair across from him. She dropped some of the formal intensity from the bar, though Jacob suspected the calculating assessment never truly turned off. "Let me give you context. The Trifold Accord we've just negotiated addresses territorial disputes that have fueled proxy wars, and ratification requires neutral witnesses," Saris continued, accepting a glass from Cathara. "Witnesses who can verify that all parties entered the negotiation freely, understood the terms, and agreed without coercion. Under Galactic Convention, such witnesses must be truly neutral, not affiliated with any party to the agreement, not subject to their authority, present by chance rather than selection." Understanding crystallized with unpleasant clarity. "I wandered into your negotiations by accident, which makes me legitimately neutral." "Exactly," Reeves confirmed. "You're not our employee, not our ally, not anyone's agent. You're a freight coordinator who took a wrong turn and happened to witness something significant. That makes your testimony valuable in ways that no planned witness could be." Jacob absorbed this while looking out at the empty void beyond the windows. "You said multiple factions want to prevent ratification. I'm guessing that makes me a target." "We've already intercepted 3 contracts on your life," Reeves said. 2 from corporate interests who profit from the current conflicts, 1 from a criminal organization whose smuggling operations depend on closed trade routes. More will come. Your death before providing formal testimony would prevent the Accord's ratification and maintain the profitable status quo. That's deeply unpleasant news." "Yes," Saris agreed, "which brings us to your options first. You can accept our protection, become formally designated as our chosen witness, and allow us to keep you alive long enough to provide testimony at the ratification ceremony. This makes you a visible target, but gives you the resources to survive." "Second option," Cathara added. "You refuse the role, we part ways, and you attempt to disappear before interested parties locate you. Given your current profile, flagged by station security systems, identified by everyone in that bar, already targeted by professional assassins, we estimate your survival time at approximately 6 hours." Jacob looked at his hands. They were calloused from cargo handling, stained with lubricants from emergency repairs he'd done earlier, completely unprepared for this situation. Those aren't really options. That's one option and suicide. We thought you might see it that way, Reeves said. For what it's worth, we don't take your safety lightly. If we're asking you to risk your life as our witness, we're committed to ensuring you survive to provide that testimony. And after, assuming I survive to testify, what happens then? The three women exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Sarah spoke first. You would be released from obligation. The accord would be binding, your testimony part of official record. Any further threats against you would be meaningless. The pact cannot be voided once ratified. Though, Cathara added, people are petty and vindictive. Revenge attacks are possible even after your testimony is moot. You paint a compelling picture, Jacob said. Where do I sign? Reeves smiled slightly. No signature required. Just verbal acceptance and a willingness to not get killed for the next several weeks. I'm generally opposed to getting killed. It's a firm policy of mine. Excellent, Sarah said. Then we begin immediately. You'll need basic security training, threat awareness, and education about the legal frameworks that make the accord binding. You'll also need to review the full terms of our agreement so your testimony is informed rather than merely observational. Jacob spent the next hours receiving what amounted to a crash course in galactic politics, treaty law, and how to recognize when someone was trying to kill you. The three women took turns educating him, their teaching styles revealing different facets of their personalities. Saris approached everything with formal precision, explaining the historical precedents and legal structures that made the Trifold Accord significant. She showed him documentation in 3 languages, walked him through diplomatic protocols, and patiently answered his questions without making him feel stupid for asking. Cathara taught threat awareness with the directness of someone who'd survived countless combat situations. She demonstrated body language cues that preceded violence, explained how to read room dynamics, and made Jacob practice identifying exits and cover positions until it became instinct. Reeves provided intelligence briefings about who wanted him dead and why, complete with organizational charts, financial networks, and operational patterns of the groups targeting him. Her presentations were clinical and thorough, treating assassination attempts like logistics problems to be solved through superior information. Through it all, Jacob contributed the only expertise he had, practical problem-solving developed from years coordinating freight through difficult territories. When Saris explained security rotations, he pointed out inefficiencies in their coverage windows. When Cathara demonstrated defensive positions, he suggested alternative routes based on cargo handling principles. When Reeves described threat assessment, he applied supply chain analysis to predict where attackers might position resources. The three women, accustomed to thinking in terms of civilizational strategy and political maneuvering, found his ground-level pragmatism surprisingly useful. You think like logistics, Reeves observed during a briefing about transport security. Everything is resource allocation and efficiency optimization. That's literally my job, Jacob said. Move things from point A to point B without losing them, breaking them, or getting killed. Turns out those skills transfer. Apparently so, Saris agreed. She was reviewing his suggestions for security coverage and making notes. Your proposed rotation schedule reduces vulnerability windows by 18% while using the same personnel allocation. It's just basic efficiency analysis. You had people overlapping in low-risk areas while leaving gaps in high-exposure transitions. Cathara laughed, that breaking glass sound that was becoming familiar. Our witness is a logistics specialist who accidentally wandered into the galaxy's most dangerous bar and is now optimizing our security rotations. The universe truly does have a sense of humor. The first assassination attempt came on the second day. Jacob was reviewing treaty documentation when alarms sounded throughout the suite. Security barriers activated. Guards rushed to defensive positions, and Kethara grabbed Jacob by the arm and moved him to a hardened interior room with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced emergency evacuations extensively. "What's happening?" Jacob asked as blast doors sealed behind them. "Someone decided 6 hours was too long to wait," Kethara said. She was monitoring multiple feeds on a tactical display, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors that Jacob's translator unhelpfully indicated meant combat readiness. "Station security detected hostile elements attempting to breach our perimeter. 3 teams, coordinated assault, probably hired by corporate interests based on equipment profiles." Saris and Reeves joined them in the hardened room, both looking calm despite the situation. Outside, Jacob could hear sounds that might have been weapons fire or energy discharges. It was hard to tell through reinforced walls designed to withstand military-grade attacks. "How long until they breach?" Reeves asked, already pulling up her own tactical displays. "They won't," Kethara said with certainty. "Their equipment is adequate for station security, insufficient for our defenses. But they'll try for approximately 7 more minutes before retreating. We'll capture at least 2 for interrogation." She was correct. The attempt lasted exactly 7 minutes before the hostile elements withdrew, leaving behind 2 unconscious operatives and enough weapon signatures to identify their employers. Reeves had her intelligence staff working on the analysis within minutes. Jacob sat in the hardened room and tried to process the fact that people had just attempted to kill him with military-grade weapons. His hands were shaking again, adrenaline finally catching up with events. "Welcome to the next several weeks of your life," Sarah said, not unkindly. "It becomes almost routine after the 3rd or 4th attempt." "That's not reassuring." "No," she agreed, "but it's honest." The attempts continued with depressing regularity. A compromised food delivery that Kethara detected through toxin analysis. A sabotage transport that Reeves' intelligence network identified before Jacob boarded. A security guard who turned out to be a deep cover agent for a smuggling cartel, and was discovered through Jacob's observation that the guard's movement patterns were inefficient for actual protection, better suited for positioning to execute an assassination. Each attempt was thwarted. Each time, Jacob survived through a combination of paranoia he was rapidly developing and the 3 women's absolute commitment to keeping him alive. He was starting to understand that when powers like this decided something mattered, they brought terrifying competence to bear. Between attempts, they moved between secure locations, never staying anywhere long enough for attackers to properly plan. Jacob learned to sleep lightly, to assess threats constantly, to never trust anything that seemed too convenient. He was becoming someone he barely recognized, still fundamentally himself, still the freight coordinator who preferred solving problems to creating them, but layered over with survival skills he'd never wanted to develop. During transit between safe houses, crowded into an armored transport with enough security to invade small nations, Jacob found himself sitting across from all 3 women as they reviewed intelligence reports. "Can I ask something?" he said during a rare moment of quiet. "Of course," Saris responded, not looking up from her displays. "Why does this matter so much? The accord, I mean. You're risking a lot to protect me so I can testify. Is reshaping trade routes and territorial boundaries really worth all this trouble?" Kethara looked up from her tactical displays, her patterns shifting to colors that suggested thoughtfulness. "The accord isn't about trade routes. It's about stopping a 17-year conflict that's killed millions, about ending corporate manipulation that profits from perpetual instability, about proving that different powers can cooperate despite our differences. The territories in dispute aren't valuable for their resources," Reeves added. "They're valuable because controlling them justifies military spending, corporate contracts, and political posturing. People die so that profit margins can be maintained. The accord ends that cycle. Saris finally looked up, her eyes shifting through colors Jacob was learning to read, sincerity mixed with determination. You asked why this matters. Because peace is harder than war, cooperation is harder than conflict, and building something is harder than maintaining profitable destruction. We're attempting to build. That requires witnesses who can verify we did it properly. Jacob thought about the corporate networks Reeves had shown him, the charts of who profited from the ongoing conflicts. Thought about the 17 years of fighting, the millions dead, the resources diverted to destruction rather than construction. Okay, he said, I'm in, not just because I don't want to die but because this actually matters. We know, Cathara said. You wouldn't have lasted this long if you were only here for self-preservation. People fighting only for themselves break under this kind of pressure. The armored transport continued through dead space toward their next secure location. Outside, stars wheeled past in patient silence, indifferent to the small struggles of people attempting to build peace in hostile circumstances. Jacob leaned back against the transport's padded walls and closed his eyes. His ship's repairs had been completed days ago. His cargo was overdue, his schedule completely destroyed, his reputation with clients probably ruined. But somehow, compared to preventing millions more deaths, delayed freight deliveries seemed less important than they had a week ago. We're approaching the diplomatic station, Reeves announced, checking her tactical feeds. Final security sweep shows complications. Define complications, Saris said, her tone suggesting she already suspected the answer would be unpleasant. 7 different factions have filed procedural challenges to Jacob's testimony. The arguments range from jurisdictional disputes to claims that he's been compromised by accepting our protection. If any challenge succeeds, it voids his witness status and potentially the entire accord. Jacob opened his eyes. Let me guess. These challenges are funded by the same people who have been trying to kill me. Correct, Reeves confirmed. They've shifted tactics. If they can't eliminate you physically, they'll eliminate you legally. It's actually quite elegant from a strategic standpoint. I'm so glad my potential murder is strategically elegant. Cathara's patterns flickered with what Jacob had learned was amusement. You're developing a sense of humor about assassination attempts. That's progress. The diplomatic station materialized ahead of them, a massive structure that represented humanity's attempt at legitimate interstellar governance. It was neutral ground, administered by the Galactic Accord Council, protected by treaties that made attacking it approximately as sensible as declaring war on physics itself. They docked through security protocols that made previous checkpoints look casual. Every weapon was declared and registered. Every individual was scanned, verified, cross-referenced against multiple databases. Jacob's freight coordinator credentials were flagged as anomalous. What was someone with his clearance level doing in the company of 3 of the galaxy's most powerful women? He's our witness, Saris explained to the security officer reviewing the flags, for the trifled accord ratification. The officer's expression shifted from suspicion to understanding to something that looked like pity. Right. The freight coordinator who wandered into the Crimson Nexus. That story's made rounds in security circles. You have my sympathy, Mr. Torres. Thanks, Jacob said. I'm collecting sympathy like other people collect stamps. They were escorted to secure quarters in the diplomatic wing, suites designed for visiting dignitaries, and protected by security systems that allegedly rivaled military installations. Jacob had his own room for the first time since this started, complete with a window showing the diplomatic station's central atrium and the elaborate architecture that communicated very important proceedings happen here. The ratification ceremony was scheduled for the following day. That gave opposition. Jacob tried to sleep and managed approximately 3 hours of fitful unconsciousness, interrupted by dreams of bars full of assassins and legal proceedings that ended with him being voided through procedural technicalities. Morning arrived whether he was ready or not. Saris provided him with formal attire suitable for diplomatic proceedings, clothing that actually fit, which felt strange after days of wearing whatever was available in secure locations. Cathara reviewed threat protocols one final time, her patterns cycling through colors that communicated both confidence and concern. Reeves briefed him on the procedural challenges they'd face, the legal arguments opposition would deploy, the political dynamics that would play out in public session. "Remember," Reeves said, "your role is simply to tell the truth. You witnessed our negotiations. You heard the terms. You can verify that we entered freely and with understanding. Everything else is legal theater that we'll handle." What if the challenges succeed? What if they void my testimony through technicalities? Then we've failed, Saris said with characteristic directness. The accord cannot be ratified without legitimate witness verification. We'll return to the status quo, ongoing conflict, corporate profiteering, millions dying over territory that matters to no one except those who profit from the fighting. "No pressure, though," Jacob muttered. Cathara gripped his shoulder with enough force to be reassuring rather than threatening. "You've survived 7 assassination attempts in 2 weeks. You can survive legal proceedings. The weapons are just words instead of energy discharges." The hearing chamber was designed to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings that suggested importance, seating arrangements that communicated hierarchy, lighting that made everyone look either noble or sinister depending on where they stood. Delegates from dozens of systems filled the gallery, representing interests that spanned from legitimate governance to barely disguised criminal enterprises. The 3 women sat at the primary table, arranged in their characteristic triangle formation. Jacob sat slightly apart, designated as neutral witness, isolated from the parties he was testifying about. Opposition delegates occupied another table, their legal representatives already shuffling documents and preparing arguments. The presiding arbiter, a Velkari elder whose name Jacob immediately forgot, called the session to order with formal phrases that Jacob's translator struggled to render into standard. The essence was clear. They were here to determine whether the trifled accord could be legitimately ratified, and whether Jacob Torres qualified as a neutral witness under Galactic Convention. Opposition opened with their strongest argument. Jacob had accepted protection from the very parties he was supposed to provide neutral testimony about. This created inherent bias and conflict of interest. How could his testimony be trusted when he was literally dependent on the accord's parties for his survival? The legal representative, a human woman whose smile suggested she enjoyed destroying people through procedural mechanisms, presented evidence of every security measure deployed to protect Jacob, every resource expended, every intervention that kept him alive. "The witness has been compromised," she concluded. "His testimony cannot be considered neutral when he owes his life to those he's testifying for. We move to void his witness status and dismiss these proceedings." Saris responded with the patience of someone who'd anticipated every argument. The witness accepted protection after multiple credible threats to his life. Refusing protection would have guaranteed his death, which would have prevented any testimony at all. Is the opposition seriously arguing that legitimate witness status requires accepting assassination? We're arguing that true neutrality cannot exist when survival depends on one party's favor. Then you're arguing that witness intimidation through death threats is a legitimate tool for voiding inconvenient testimony. I suggest the Council consider the implications of that precedent. The arguments continued, legal representatives deploying increasingly creative interpretations of witness requirements, neutrality definitions, and procedural frameworks. Jacob sat in his isolated chair and watched civilization's best legal minds debate whether keeping him alive constituted improper influence. Cathara took her turn, speaking with the directness of someone whose culture valued clarity over diplomatic nuance. The witness was threatened because his testimony is valuable. We protected him because allowing his murder would void the accord through violence rather than legitimate process. If the opposition's argument succeeds, you're establishing that assassination is an acceptable tool for preventing witness testimony. I suggest you consider whether you want to live in that galaxy. Reeves approached from the intelligence angle, presenting documentation of every faction that had attempted to kill Jacob, their financial networks, their connections to opposition delegates. These challenges aren't good faith legal arguments. They're continuation of assassination attempts through procedural means. The same people who tried to kill our witness with weapons are now trying to kill his testimony with technicalities. The presiding arbiter called for recess while the council deliberated. Jacob was escorted to a private chamber where the three women joined him, their expressions ranging from confident to concerned. "How do you think it's going?" Jacob asked. "Unclear," Saris admitted. "The legal arguments have merit even if their motivations are corrupt. The council must balance legitimate procedural concerns against the reality that strict neutrality is impossible when one side is willing to use murder. So we might lose on technicalities even though we're right." "Welcome to galactic politics," Cathara said, "where being right and winning are occasionally unrelated concepts." They returned to the chamber after 90 minutes. The council had reached preliminary conclusions, but wanted additional testimony before final ruling. Specifically, they wanted to hear directly from Jacob about his understanding of the situation and whether he felt his testimony had been compromised. Jacob stood at the witness podium, acutely aware that every word would be recorded, analyzed, and potentially used to either ratify or void the accord. The presiding arbiter looked at him with an expression that suggested sympathy mixed with professional detachment. "Mr. Torres, you've been designated as neutral witness to the trifled accord. In your own words, please explain your understanding of what you witnessed and whether you believe your testimony has been compromised." Jacob looked at the three women sitting at their table, at Saris who'd taught him diplomatic protocols with patient precision, at Cathara who'd trained him to recognize threats and survive them, at Reeves who'd provided him with information and treated him like an intelligence asset worth protecting, at the opposition delegates whose legal arguments were funded by the same networks that had tried to kill him 7 times. He took a breath and spoke the truth. "2 weeks ago, I was a freight coordinator who took a wrong turn and ended up in a bar I shouldn't have been in. I heard 3 women negotiating an agreement that I didn't understand was significant until they explained it to me. They told me I'd become a witness, that my testimony was required for the accord to be legitimate, and that multiple factions would try to kill me to prevent that testimony." He paused, organizing thoughts that had been forming over days of survival and education. "They offered me protection, which I accepted because the alternative was dying within 6 hours. Since then, I've survived 7 assassination attempts. I've been educated about the Accord's terms, the legal frameworks that make it binding, and the political implications of what I witnessed. The opposition argues this compromises my neutrality." Jacob looked directly at the opposition table. "Here's what I know. In 2 weeks of constant threats, not once did any of these 3 women suggest I should lie. Not once did they tell me what to say beyond tell the truth. They had countless opportunities to coach me, to manipulate my testimony, to compromise my understanding. Instead, they kept me alive and educated me about what I was witnessing, so my testimony would be informed rather than ignorant." He turned back to the arbiter. "The opposition claims I'm biased because I owe my life to the Accord's parties. But I owe my life to them specifically because I refuse to lie, refuse to run, refuse to be silenced by people who profit from ongoing conflict. If that constitutes bias, then you're saying honest witnesses must die to maintain procedural purity. I don't think that's what Galactic Convention intended." The chamber was silent. Jacob realized his hands were shaking again, but this time from conviction rather than fear. "I witnessed three powers negotiate in good faith. I heard terms that would end 17 years of conflict and save millions of lives. I can verify they entered freely, understood the terms, and agreed without coercion. That's my testimony. Whether you accept it is your decision. But you should know that rejecting it means accepting that death threats are legitimate tools for preventing inconvenient truth." He sat down. The three women were looking at him with expressions he couldn't fully read. Saris with something like pride, Kethara with approval, Reeves with the slight smile of someone who'd bet on an unexpected outcome and won. The opposition's legal representative stood to respond, but the presiding arbiter raised a hand. "The council has heard sufficient testimony. We will deliberate and announce our ruling within the hour." The wait was excruciating. Jacob spent it in the private chamber with the three women, none of them speaking much, all of them processing the reality that everything came down to whether bureaucrats decided procedural purity mattered more than practical reality. Finally, they were summoned back to the chamber. The presiding arbiter stood, formal robes arranged in configurations that probably communicated significance to those who understood the symbolism. "The council has considered the challenges to witness status and finds them without merit. While Mr. Torres did accept protection from the Accords parties, this protection was necessitated by credible death threats from opposition interests. Requiring witnesses to refuse protection in the face of assassination attempts would establish an untenable precedent that weaponizes murder for procedural advantage." Jacob felt tension drain from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Furthermore," the arbiter continued, "the witness's testimony demonstrates informed understanding of the Accord's terms and clear recollection of the negotiation circumstances. His status as truly neutral, present by accident rather than design, unaffiliated with any party before the encounter, is unchallenged. The council rules that his testimony is admissible and legitimate." Opposition delegates were already filing protests, but the arbiter spoke over them. "The trifled accord, as witnessed by Jacob Torres and verified through proper testimony, is hereby ratified under Galactic Convention. The terms are binding upon all parties. This session is concluded." The chamber erupted in reactions ranging from celebration to outrage. Jacob sat in his witness chair and tried to process that he just participated in reshaping power dynamics across multiple sectors by telling the truth about what he'd seen in a bar. Saris, Kethara, and Reeves approached his chair together, their triangle formation somehow conveying both victory and relief. "Well done, witness," Saris said formally. Then less formally, "Thank you. For surviving, for testifying honestly, for not breaking under pressure that would have destroyed most people." "I'm a freight coordinator," Jacob said, still processing. "I coordinate freight. This was significantly outside my expertise." "You coordinated truth through hostile circumstances," Kethara observed. "Same skill set, different cargo." Reeves was already reviewing intelligence feeds on her personal display. "The ratification triggers immediate implementation. Trade routes open within hours. Territorial transitions begin next week. Corporate interests are already scrambling to adapt. You've just prevented what intelligence projected would be another decade of profitable conflict. So I can go back to my ship now, back to actual freight coordination." "You can," Saris confirmed, "though we'd like to offer alternatives. Formal positions within our organizations, roles that utilize your particular talents for logistics and honest assessment." Jacob considered the offers: status, authority, resources beyond anything a freight coordinator typically accessed. Then he thought about his ship, his cargo routes, the straightforward satisfaction of moving things from point A to point B without getting involved in galaxy-shaping political events. "I appreciate the offers," he said carefully, "but I think I'm better suited to freight, It's what I know, what I'm good at. This whole experience has been educational, but I prefer cargo that doesn't involve assassination attempts." "That's understandable," Reeves said, "though we'd like to propose something less formal. When future negotiations require neutral witnesses, may we contact you? Your testimony here has established precedent. A freight coordinator who stumbled into significance and testified honestly. That carries weight in diplomatic circles." Jacob thought about it. About the accord they'd ratified, the lives potentially saved, the satisfaction of contributing to something larger than himself while still maintaining the life he'd built. "Okay," he agreed, "but only for significant negotiations. I'm not testifying about trade disputes over luxury goods or corporate merger frameworks. If you need me to witness something that actually matters, contact me. I'll show up, listen carefully, and tell the truth about what I heard." "That's all we ask," Sarah said. They departed the diplomatic station through less intensive security than entry. Ratified witnesses apparently rated lower threat assessment than pending ones. Jacob's ship was waiting in the commercial docking bay, repairs completed, cargo still secured in the hold. His delayed deliveries would cost him some client relationships, but Reeves had quietly arranged compensation that more than covered the financial losses. 6 months later, Jacob was back on Station Cos 7, reviewing shipping manifests in a different bar, one that catered to actual freight coordinators rather than assassins and mercenaries. His communicator chimed with an incoming message from an encrypted source. The message was from Matriarch Saris. Another significant negotiation was scheduled, this one involving resource allocation in newly opened territories. The three powers needed a neutral witness. Would he be willing? Jacob looked at his manifest, calculated that he could reschedule the delivery without catastrophic consequences, sent his confirmation. Being a professional witness to galaxy-shaping negotiations hadn't been his planned career path. But it turned out that showing up, paying attention, and telling the truth were skills that transferred surprisingly well across contexts. And at least now, when he walked into bars, he knew enough to recognize when he should probably leave immediately. Usually, he was still working on that part. His communicator chimed again, Cathara sending coordinates for the next secure meeting location, along with a note that said simply, "Try not to wander into any assassination zones before we collect you." Jacob smiled and finished his drink, which was significantly better than what the Crimson Nexus had served, another improvement in his life since accidentally becoming important.